So I finally played through Final Fantasy V for the first time. Well, kind of. Actually played this a little bit through emulation way back in the day. But even for that little bit I played of it, something did stand out to me that makes this game really special. And outside of that one thing, Final Fantasy V does feel like a little bit of an oddball for a handful of reasons. It suffers from the same problems that Final Fantasy II and III do, of not being localized and brought to the US until much later on in its life cycle. Final Fantasy V released in the US about 7 years after its initial release in Japan. And as a brief reminder, in the US we went from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy II, and then Final Fantasy III right into Final Fantasy VII. But Final Fantasy II for the US was really Final Fantasy IV, and Final Fantasy III was really Final Fantasy VI. It was our Lord and Savior Final Fantasy VII that came out and corrected all the numbers, and everything was adjusted accordingly from there. Now, when Final Fantasy V did first come to the US, it came out on a PlayStation port, and it released only just a few weeks after the much anticipated Final Fantasy VIII came out. And as you can imagine, Final Fantasy VIII drastically overshadowed Final Fantasy V in the US. It also didn't help that the PlayStation port of Final Fantasy V was known for having some terrible load times, which I'm sure would have soured that initial experience for many players. It wasn't until years later, in 2006, where the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy V released and started putting some respect on the name of Final Fantasy V. And because of these time framing issues of when it released, it feels like Final Fantasy V is very easily overlooked, maybe even putting into the category of a forgotten entry or a hidden gem. Now, another reason this game might come off as an oddball is that this game's known for having a more straightforward story that's a little bit one-dimensional with its villain, and the game feel overall is much more fun and jovial, with a lot of moments of humor and silliness throughout the game, which is a very big contrast to Final Fantasy IV. For a modern-day comparison, it almost feels like the Marvel movie of Final Fantasy, which I don't hate. I think it works really good for Final Fantasy V, but again, Final Fantasy IV and VI were known for being very story-rich, which this game was sandwiched in between in Japan, and for the US release, it came out right after Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, which were both also really story-rich. So Final Fantasy V probably just didn't meet a lot of people's lore and story expectations that they would have had. And also for US audiences, it kind of lacks that edgy and cool factor that Final Fantasy VII and VIII definitely dove into. And even if this game does have a little bit of a weaker story plot overall, the game is actually pretty long and has a lot of content, like finding and earning some powerful hidden summons and discovering the legendary weapons. And it even brings in some mega bosses, although you don't always get rewards for beating them. But while the story may not be edgy, some of the artwork on the enemies is definitely pretty hardcore and even grotesque at times. And the story is only simpler in that it doesn't have a lot of crazy plot twists or gotcha moments. It's more of a very clear and lean story. It has some key moments that are impactful, emotional, and dramatic for sure, but I feel like it kind of lacks a lot of those big mic drop moments that you see in some other Final Fantasies, and key memory moments outside of maybe one scene that I'll talk about later on. And I really enjoyed the time I had playing through this game. I played through the Pixel Remaster version, which adds a lot of quality of life adjustments to the game as it does with the other entries. It's got the updated music, a lot of difficulty customization options, and things that just make it a much better, well-rounded experience. It does lack some of the extra content that comes with the Game Boy Advance version of the game, like a few extra jobs and a couple story beats, but from what I've seen, the extra content really isn't anything that special. But as mentioned, I did play it before it was officially released in the US way back in the day through emulation, and I think there's actually a solid core audience that did mostly play this game through emulation first, at least in the US anyway. And the thing I remember is running through this air duct dungeon and finding the fire crystal, getting the shards, and then mostly playing around with the job system. Final Fantasy V takes the foundation that Final Fantasy III made, where you can assign your characters different jobs at different points and kind of level the jobs up independently. But it takes that system and just greatly expands on it and makes it infinitely better. There are 20 jobs in this game, and every job is leveled up independently through ability points. You get a handful of these after each fight. Most jobs will have some type of native ability attached to them from the start, but as you start unlocking more ability points, you'll start getting new skills and abilities, expanding what that job can do, eventually leading you into mastering that job. Now, most jobs have 2 ability slots, and they can assign 2 abilities to each job. One slot is strictly for the job you're using. For most of the magic classes, just being able to use their magic is their native ability, but for example, a job like Thief, its native ability is Steal. At 10 ability points, Thief earns the ability Passages, which allows them to see hidden walls and things on the main map. And then at 20 ability points, Thief learns Flee, so you can escape from battle. So if you want to use Passages, you put in the secondary slot. If you would rather be able to escape from battle, you swap that out and put Flee in its place. And there's a lot of unique abilities in this game. Some jobs have way more than others, and some abilities are pretty easy to earn with only 10, 20, 40, or even 100 ability points, but some jobs get crazy. For example, Red Mage needs 999 ability points to learn their final ability, which is Dual Cast, which allows you to cast 2 spells in the same turn, which is incredibly powerful, especially later on. But where things really start to get interesting is that second ability slot, as the second slot allows you to pick from any ability that you've learned from any job. So this is where you can really start mix matching abilities and doing some crazy stuff. For example, take Dual Cast from the Red Mage, put it on the Black Mage, and now you're dual casting all your offensive powerful spells like Fire, Thandaga, and more importantly, Flare. Now there are 2 jobs in this game that break the mold of this system. Freelancer, the job you start out with, which seems kind of weak at the start, and Mime, unlocked near the end of the game. Freelancer can equip 2 abilities freely, they're not bound to anything, but it also gets stats of any of the jobs you've mastered, which can make Freelancer one of the most powerful jobs stat-wise and customization-wise later on in the game, and you have that freedom to use any job ability you want. Now the Mime is a little similar to this, but the Mime gets 3 ability slots instead, but the Mime also gets a very powerful ability where it can copy the last action a party member did, meaning if you've got that dual casting Flare teammate on your team or a powerful summoner, Mime can just copy what they do even if they don't have that ability unlocked or learn themselves. It's really quite helpful and kind of starts making the game a little nuts. And Freelancer or Mime are pretty unique jobs to the Final Fantasy V system, and it's where things will start running wild and going crazy and kind of honestly start breaking the game a little bit. But I think more importantly, there's another job in Final Fantasy V that stands out and makes it special, and that job is the Blue Mage. Final Fantasy V is the first one that introduced the concept of a Blue Mage, and for those of you who may not know, the Blue Mage is a spellcaster, but instead of learning your spells from scrolls or vendors, you actually learn your spells from monsters using the abilities on you in order to expand your spellbook. And exploring the map, finding these monsters, trying to bait them out to use these spells is like a weird Pokemon chasing game in itself, and it's just a really fun thing to do. Admittedly, it is sometimes annoying because there are some very unique special ones, and you're probably going to need a map or a guide for the most part because there are some you can actually miss overall. But Blue Mage is just a really fun and unique job in the game, and most of the spells are really worth it, and overall the mage is very strong, very versatile, and can do a lot of things. And because of how it uses monster abilities, it just really made it stand out. Now, while the job system to me is probably the best thing about Final Fantasy V, it can feel a little restrictive at times, as it can take a nice chunk of time to get ability points and unlock enough abilities to where you can really start pulling off fun and exciting combos and really just getting creative with it. This means you might have to grind out your ability points for a while, which sure, there are some spots in mid to late game that can make this much easier, but while grinding in a game may not bother some, it could be one of those things that might sour a game for folks. And this crazy unique job system has even inspired some groups to take on challenge runs where you lock yourself into using certain classes or unique combinations either for fun or just to give a heightened level of difficulty. It's not something I would want to do personally, but I just wanted to call it out. But while the job system is amazing, I think we should take a look at one of the main reasons people tend to be attracted to Final Fantasy games, and that's the story and the characters. As mentioned, Final Fantasy V's story feels a bit more like a Marvel movie, and what I mean by that is the game has much more humor injected into it. It's got a more lighthearted charm, and some of the characters will be quippy, silly, and even like to have fun with puns. And this doesn't mean the story's bad or that it sucks. I think the story is actually pretty decent overall. It isn't the most groundbreaking thing or the most moving story, but it's good. Now, the main character and the leader of the group is Bartz. Bartz is kind of just a chill, lighthearted, funny dude who loves to travel around the world with his chocobo Boko. Bartz is that everyman that rises up and becomes the hero, and because of this, while Bartz is enjoyable, he does feel a little bit more muted, not just in this game, but also just compared to other Final Fantasy protagonists as a whole. Now, once the Wyrn Crystal breaks and a meteor crashes to Earth, Bartz goes to investigate this and happens across the Princess Lena, who needs a quick saving, and he runs into a warrior named Golf. Lena is the princess whose family is devoted to protecting the wind crystal, along with their pet dragons, which the family is strongly loyal towards. Now, while Lena does have a lot of touching moments throughout the games, usually making some type of self-sacrificial move, usually involving her dragons, it does feel like she doesn't really develop too much as a character otherwise. She is the character of the group that's maybe the most focused on trying to make sure we save the world at times, but to me, she just kind of feels like she's along for the ride. Now, Golf is a silly old warrior who for some reason can't remember anything, and he serves as a funny old man and comic relief to the group for the most part, and often indulges in a lot of puns. But once he starts remembering who he is, you start to realize this silly old man is actually a legendary badass, and Golf's trying to pass this torch of heroism onto the new generation. Your third member is Ferris, and they seem to be the crowd favorite of most players, maybe because they're a bit more complex and spunky than the other characters. Ferris is the pirate leader, and you meet them early on in the game, and they also happen to have a pet dragon. Cool. You also find out eventually in the game that Ferris is actually a girl pretending to be a guy, so her crew doesn't mistake her for being weak or take advantage of her. Additionally, you also find out that her and Lena have much more in common than just having pet dragons. But the complaint I have with Ferris is that kind of feels like they don't know what to do with her in the later part of the game, other than just making her miss the pirate life. Now, there is another party member you get much later on in the game, and her name is Kryle. She ends up being Golf's granddaughter. I kind of enjoyed her, as she's a little bit of a badass in her own right. She shows up a handful of times and sort of saves the day when needed. The thing with her, though, is that she eventually ends up taking Golf's place in the party, which is fine. As mentioned, Golf's goal was to pass that torch of heroism onto the new generations. And spoilers, of course, Golf passes this torch on by making a heroic sacrifice. And this final scene where Golf tries to take on the main villain by himself to save everyone is kind of one of the more memorable and stronger moments in the game. And one of the good things, too, they do with Golf is when he does eventually pass, it shows the team trying to revive him and bring him back and failing, kind of cementing that, yes, this legendary warrior is truly gone and truly dead. Now, while this is a good moment in the game overall, from a gameplay perspective, it's a little upsetting because the loss of Golf isn't really felt at all, because everything you've learned with Golf, all his equipment, the abilities you've unlocked, the jobs you mastered, all just get passed right on to Kryle. So in a way, it kind of feels like you didn't really lose anything, and to me, this also made Kryle not feel like her own person as much anymore. The only real change you feel now is instead of having a legendary old man making punny jokes all the time, you now have this young hipstery girl in your party that Bart's kind of likes to big brother, who's just trying to make her late grandfather proud. Now, the overall plot is that there's an evil force known as X-Death, and X-Death is trying to first destroy the elemental crystals so that they can truly be set free, and then they are trying to then break the sealing crystals to unlock the void so that X-Death can use the power of the void to erase everything from existence. The void itself is a chaotic power that was sealed away. However, sealing it away caused the world to be split into two, each world having its own world map and its own set of crystals. But the splitting of the world and all the sealing of the void, that'll happen thousands of years before Final Fantasy V picks up. Now, many hundreds of years later, an evil named X-Death was created. X-Death is basically an evil giant Deku tree that grew on anger and the hatred of countless evil spirits, monsters, and the frustration that comes from the destruction and abuse of nature. This tree ultimately manifested itself into the nightly entity known as X-Death, and X-Death learned about the power of the void and wanted to use that power to get revenge, since all it really knows is malice and hatred towards mankind. This makes X-Death as a villain just a raw force of chaotic nature that only wants to erase life from existence using the power of the void. Because of this, you can't really reason at all with X-Death. And he has this aura about him, as a lot of times when he shows up, he'll just start throwing hands and handing out beatdowns left and right, and you get this feeling whenever he shows up of, oh crap, X-Death is here. With that said, though, Bart's and team aren't the first group to actually have to deal with X-Death or handle him. 30 years before the game starts, X-Death was, as mentioned, sealed away by a legendary group of 4 warriors, the Dawn Warriors. And that funny old man Golf, he was actually one of these warriors. Now, you don't get to play as any of the other Dawn Warriors, but they do help you out throughout your journey. And Bart's dad was actually one of these warriors as well. However, he passed away before the events of the game take place, and you really only see him through flashbacks that Bart's has. There is also Zazant, who helps Bart's and his team wage war on Exdeath, helping us break the barrier around his castle and launch a powerful offense against Exdeath's giant fleshy castle, leading to some very cool set pieces and exciting moments. And the final Dawn Warrior is a werewolf, which is pretty cool. Kelgar the werewolf kinda doesn't do much other than be cool though. He does test Bart's sword skills at one point in a neat little moment, and the werewolves do give Bart's and team a spirit bomb in their time of need, but all you really remember Kelgar for is just being a werewolf. Now, because Exdeath is this chaotic manifestation, the Dawn Warriors couldn't really defeat him, and that's why they sealed him away using the help of the elemental crystals. But now, since the crystals are shattering, Exdeath is coming back, and that's why Bart's and team are ultimately trying to save the crystals. But then that leads you to wonder, why are the crystals shattering? Well, the crystals are shattering because the engineer Sid made some powerful machines that harvest the power of the crystals to use it as a fuel source so that people can live comfortable lives. And this is something Sid actually ends up deeply regretting and trying to make up for throughout the game. Now, unlike other Final Fantasies, you don't actually ever truly save the crystals here because they all get shattered. And ultimately, it's these little pieces that you gather up and try to get what little power you can out of them. Gameplay-wise, this is how you end up getting all the jobs in the game, but ultimately, because the crystals are forever gone, once you beat the game, it kind of leaves you in a world where humanity is no longer governed and protected by the power of the crystals, and the world is truly in the hands of mankind now. And most of the themes of this game are learning about the past and hoping that a new generation rises up, taking on the roles of heroes so that they can stop the same evil that their forefathers once rose up and sealed away long ago. And there are many characters throughout this game, both human and creature, that self-sacrifice and give their life to help Bart's and squad carry out this goal. The game also uses a lot of flashbacks for storytelling, like us discovering about Bart's past and how he kind of doesn't have anyone left in the world anymore other than his trusted Chocobo. And while a lot of these elements are good, I just don't think they ever really hit those emotional peaks that you got with some of the other Final Fantasies. As mentioned, this game is funny and it dares to be silly, and the silliness comes and takes a lot of forms. My personal favorite moment is you meet this wise old turtle who's helping you defeat Exdeath by giving you guidance and letting you know a lot of ancient knowledge and passing it down. Now, Exdeath knows about this old turtle, but he doesn't quite know where the turtle's hiding. So what does Exdeath do? He gets a plan. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that Exdeath was originally a tree, and so Exdeath turns himself into a wooden splinter. And at one point in the game where some other comedic moments are happening, a party member just happens to step on a splinter, and honestly, you don't really think much of it at all when it happens. Now, eventually, you return to the turtle to get some more advice. However, Exdeath then emerges from this splinter, and, well...
Next time on Dragon Ball Z.
I honestly burst out laughing when this Dragon Ball Z fight started happening between Exdeath and this turtle. It really just blurs that line of fun and silliness and cool, and I just kind of loved it. But Exdeath isn't the only villain who's actually cool and hilarious. Exdeath actually gets a lot of minions throughout this game. Most of them come from when he starts opening the void, but he does have one very special ally, and that special ally is Gilgamesh. Yeah, that Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a fun character overall. He's a very 90s morning cartoon villain henchman, and he is actually somewhat skillful in combat, and he has a pretty fun theme song. Despite his silly nature, Gilgamesh actually has one of the better character arcs in the game, surprisingly, and because of that, that's probably one of the reasons why he's such a crowd favorite overall, and a reason why he's probably shown up in other Final Fantasies as a hidden boss type character. But to start kind of winding this down a little bit, I think Final Fantasy V is actually a pretty great game overall. I actually really enjoyed it. I think it stands up in its own right, and I would honestly highly recommend it over some of the other ones I've played so far. I would argue that this is maybe just a better, more enhanced version of Final Fantasy III, which I also enjoyed. 5 just carries a lot of those classic Final Fantasy story elements of heroism and sacrifice, and uses a lot of those classic Final Fantasy themes like chocobos, crystals, and moogles really well. And again, fighting strong bosses for hidden summons and even mega bosses is a nice addition, and it has one of the most amazing job-based systems of the Final Fantasies. I know it's kind of odd to say this, but to me Final Fantasy V just really feels like a Final Fantasy because it uses all of these elements so well. The main downsides of this game are the villain Exdeath, while having some unique and fun moments, he is kind of a little bit forgettable. He doesn't have any personal connection to the group at all, and he's just a bit of a generic pure evil bad guy that you have to stop. There's no emotional stake really in defeating him beyond just saving the world. In this game, like some Marvel movies, it does take the funnies a little too far at times and maybe indulges in them just a little bit too much. But I think if you really enjoy lighthearted stories overall, Final Fantasy V can kind of hit a sweet spot, which it sort of did with me a little bit. And when I do make my inevitable tier list of all the Final Fantasies when I'm done running through all the mainline numbered ones, I kind of see this being somewhat high on the list. But we are nearing the dawn of the end of the Pixel Remastered collection, and the famed Final Fantasy VI awaits. And Final Fantasy VI is actually a game that, despite its credible reputation from both the internet and friends alike, I've never actually sat down and played it all the way through. So subscribe if you want to see a fresh old face go through Final Fantasy VI for the first time. And if you like this video, just please like and subscribe overall. It helps me out a lot. And in the comments below, just let me know of Final Fantasy V, what your favorite job combos are, and maybe what your favorite moments are in the game. But as always, for now, drive fast, take chances. Later, nerds.